Hello again. We like to put in frequent plugs for the books that are in our basic library for Christians and also basic library for Jehovah's Witnesses, two separate playlists that you can consult on our channel. I've put in a plug for this one over 2 years ago. I'd like to bring your attention to it again, especially for those who haven't seen that particular video, and I'll supplement this by adding that link at the end. This is the Tetragrammaton and the Christian Greek Scriptures by Lynn Lundquist. The introduction to him is in the other video. But I've never met anyone who's done a better job of analyzing the question of the Tetragrammaton and the Christian Greek Scriptures and all of the repercussions coming from the assumption that Jehovah's Witnesses make that somehow the church got a hold of all the manuscripts and has erased any evidence of the Tetragrammaton's presence in those early texts. He deals with all of the ramifications that derive from that belief here in 3 pages. I'm going to read now from pages 101 to 104. Unorchestrated distribution of manuscripts. We now encounter an interesting question in our study of the Tetragrammaton and the Christian Greek Scriptures. That question is simply, why did some ancient manuscripts survive while others were lost? If we have thought to ask this first question, then it would occur to us to ask a second question with the Tetragrammaton manuscripts in mind. Is it probable that none of the Tetragrammaton manuscript copies survived, while 5,000 Kurios manuscript copies remain? The history of manuscript transmission to successive generations is a portrayal of 2 unorchestrated processes. One is the process of copying manuscripts. The other is the process of distributing and preserving these same manuscripts. Each of these 2 processes is so unsupervised and uncontrollable that they take on the appearance of random events. Most of us have had some contact with the notion of random events or probability. It is helpful to understand that that we are actually talking about an application of probability when we compare variant readings within extant ancient Greek manuscripts. Of the total copies made in the early centuries, only a small percentage of these copies survived. Surviving copies of ancient Christian scripture manuscripts represent a random selection of the original number of manuscripts. And he has a footnote there. He says, we are fully confident that Jehovah God, notice how graceful he is in talking like Jehovah's Witnesses talk. He originally aimed this book at them. We are fully confident that Jehovah God has carefully guarded his written word and did not allow its destruction outside of his control. This does not mean that random probability is not operative, but it means that God is in control of the process. It is interesting, however, to realize that a statement saying that all copies of the correct text were lost is a direct affront to the ability of God to care for the Christian Greek Scriptures through time. So he's caught the witnesses in an internal contradiction here because they claim that God has indeed done that, preserved the manuscripts, the truth of the original manuscripts. He goes on, there was most likely a random distribution of manuscript accuracy when the first copies of the original Greek scripture documents were made. While making the very first copies, most scribes paid close attention to detail and made nearly flawless copies. On the other hand, there were undoubtedly some scribes who carelessly made early copies, which had more than the average number of copying mistakes. These copies, from the most accurately copied to the most carelessly copied, were potentially recopied and carried to remote locations of the Roman Empire. What kind of copies have survived to our day? Again, we would expect a random distribution of the most accurate to the most carelessly reproduced copies. Preservation was not particularly conditioned by the precision exercised by scribes or copyists. Preservation was determined by factors such as the absence of early invading armies, a warm, dry climate, or preservation in a forgotten monastery. We do not discount Jehovah's supervision in the preservation of the Greek manuscripts. However, we are suggesting that there are at least 2 types of random processes which have produced the copies of early Greek manuscripts which we possess today. The first random process dealt with the factors which reproduced either good or poor copies of the original Greek scriptures. The second random process concerns factors which caused certain manuscripts to survive while the rest were lost or destroyed. We can state the problem in a slightly different way. We can only conjecture as to some unknown number representing the total number of Christian Greek scripture portions produced in the first 10 centuries of the Christian era. Most certainly, the actual number would be in the hundreds of thousands, inasmuch as copying scripture was an ongoing process. Of this number, some manuscripts were destroyed soon after they were copied. Some had long and useful life and were copied many times, producing further generations of copies, duplicating their unique idiosyncrasies. A small number of these copies were carried to geographical locations whose climatic conditions aided in their preservation. Of the huge number of possible early Greek manuscripts, only a small number of the total would eventually be preserved and located so that they could come to light for scholarly research in the period of time between the 16th century and today. In order to explain the Tetragrammaton's removal from the Christian Greek scriptures, we must superimpose over this first set of random probabilities a second condition requiring a very carefully planned, non-random series of events. What would be required in order to obliterate the presence of the Tetragrammaton from the original writings of the Christian Greek scriptures? The entire train of events would need to be altered. No longer could we allow a random process of copying and preserving documents. We would be forced to believe that in all other aspects concerning the preservation of Greek scripture documents, a true random distribution took place. Yet, only in this one area, concerning the removal of the Tetragrammaton, would we accept the fact that both the copy process and the preservation of the text became completely uniform. Though we see no evidence of that fact today, we are asked to believe that all inspired Christian writers used the Tetragrammaton. Then we would need to acknowledge that all 3rd century copyists used only kurios. We would next need to believe that all copies containing the Tetragrammaton were subsequently lost at a precise point in time so that they were never again copied. Finally, we would need to believe that there was total agreement among all church fathers from the 2nd century on that this new corrupted text represented the true apostolic writings. All the while, we would need to ignore the countless early Christians who suffered daily for their faith, many to the point of martyrdom. We would need to believe that they would give their lives to protect their precious scriptures from the Romans, but when heretics forcefully acquired all scrolls containing the Tetragrammaton, they willingly acquiesced with such unanimity and silence that no protest was ever recorded. This would be a most unprecedented event within the history of the early church. For a heresy of this magnitude to take place so soon after the apostles' deaths is most difficult to believe. That it could be so well controlled that not even a single reference to its existence has been preserved is beyond reasonable belief. That all traces of the supposed early documents which contain the Tetragrammaton could be completely expunged in the short interval required, however, becomes a statistical impossibility. And then he has a footnote about the Arian debate, where all this really hits the fan around the turn of the 4th century. In truth, it is even more difficult to imagine because of the 4th century controversy over the person of Christ. The controversy is generally known in history as Arianism, named after Arius, a presbyter of Alexandria who died in 336 CE. It is not our interest or intent to evaluate the theological position of either group in that debate. Nonetheless, this event of history most certainly gives us insight into the presumed presence of the Tetragrammaton in the Christian Greek scriptures. One group maintained that the Son was not of the same substance as the Father, understanding him to be a created being, though pre-existent to the created world. There is considerable writing of the early church fathers dealing with this controversy from both sides of the argument. We must ask ourselves a very important question. If, as is claimed, there was evidence of any kind that the Tetragrammaton was used 237 times in the Christian Greek scriptures by the original authors, why did those advocating a created Jesus never bolster their argument with this information. No single logical argument would have supported their cause more eloquently than the citation of the Tetragrammaton from within the Greek Scriptures texts. Or are we to believe that men living in 350 CE had never read Greek Scripture manuscripts which still existed from the apostolic times? In fact, Origen contributed substance to this controversy, that's the Arian controversy, by his teaching that the Father and the Son possess a separate essence, calling Jesus a secondary God, and the Father the God. Most certainly, the writings of Origen himself would have provided the textual evidence necessary to substantiate the presence of the Tetragrammaton had it been available. And elsewhere in the book, he cites Origen frequently to prove that, although we have most of his writings, apparently, not all of them, but a great many of them anyway, hundreds of pages worth, we find no evidence that can support the idea that he used the Tetragrammaton, even though he believed, more like the Arians in this area, of the nature of the Son. So no, there's no evidence. So if you want the whole case, get the book. It's free, by the way. You can get it at archive.org. Download the PDF, because he put it in when Lundquist published this originally in the 1990s. He made it public domain instantly. He didn't want to profit by this. He wanted us to all be blessed by it, witness or not witness. So you can get it, and you can download it from his own site, which I think is still up on his own website, although I think he's gone now, but the website, is, last time I checked, is still there, tetragrammaton.org. So get the book and use this information with your JW loved ones. See you next time.